Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Our History Has Always Been Contraband, in Defense of Black Studies. Edited by Colin Kaepernick, Robin D.G. Kelley, and Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor. Narrated by Jaime Lincoln Smith. Preface. Colin Kaepernick. Black history cannot help but be politically oriented, for it tends towards the total redefinition of an experience which was highly political. Black history must be political, for it deals with the most political phenomenon of all, the struggle between the master and the slave, between the colonized and the colonizer, between the oppressed and the oppressor. And it recognizes that all histories of peoples participate in politics and are shaped by political and ideological views. Vincent Harding, 1970. Let's begin by saying that we are living through a very dangerous time. Originally penned in 1963, James Baldwin's words are just as relevant today as when first inked 60 years ago. From ongoing assaults on our bodies in the form of police terrorism, and more largely, the prison industrial complex, to the denigration of our collective brilliance and generational resistance in the form of banning classroom content and curricula that centers Black people and our histories, we are under attack, and we are living through a very dangerous time. While malignant strikes on the full and unabridged humanity of Black people is nothing new, the recent well-coordinated white supremacist counterinsurgency in the area of public education deserves our attention. Early in 2021, in the context of debates over precisely what content from a piloted high school advanced placement, AP, African American Studies course would appear in the curriculum's final version, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis proclaimed that African American Studies lacks educational value. His comment should be read both as a reassertion of white supremacy and as a clear invitation to other governors, state legislatures, and boards of education to ban or significantly augment curricula that centers the histories of Black people and an analysis of the relationship between systemic racism and the violent origins of the United States. At the time of this writing, Florida and at least 17 other states have laws or policies that restrict the teaching of race or racism. Make no mistake about it, attempted and achieved bans on the teaching of Black studies throughout the country are more than an attack on Black people. They're also an assault on all social justice movements, as well as non-Black people of color and white co-conspirators fighting for a better, freer, and more just society. We cannot and will not let agents of white supremacy dictate our future, our stories, and our humanity. We cannot and will not let this moment pass without chopping at the roots that allow white supremacy to metastasize. My fellow editors and I, as well as the countless others who have given their time, talents, and labor to this project, are honored to share with you our history has always been contraband in defense of Black studies. Alongside powerful work being led by organizations like the African American Policy Forum, Dream Defenders, and cohorts upon cohorts of student organizers from around the country, I hope this collection of historical and contemporary essays, some of which are original, can be used as a resource to deepen our collective understanding of Black history through the discipline of Black studies, a dynamic field of study whose 20th century origins were birthed in resistance to the very foundations of Western thought and the U.S. university system. As Robin D.G. Kelley has recently written, Black Studies has helped to chronicle and analyze how Black communities have tried to remake and re-envision the world through art, through ideas, through social movements, through literature, through study and action. Our history has always been contraband is precisely this. It's study in action. As you make your way through this book, you'll notice that it is divided into 3 parts. 1, how we got here. 2, the history they don't want you to know. And 3, how we fight back. Part 1 offers a clear historical framework for understanding the history of the present. That is, Our accumulated histories of both oppression and resistance have shaped our present political moment. Part 2 is replete with essential readings in both Black studies and, more generally, Black history. Essays in Part 3 offer reflections on and practical steps for ensuring that our histories and the histories of white supremacy in the United States are included in any curriculum worthy of true educational value. As Saidiya Hartman has elegantly asked, what are the stories one tells in dark times? This, in part, is the question that Our History Has Always Been Contraband helps to answer. My hope is that what's contained within this book will help us draw connections between past and present struggles and to find inspiration in our histories of community resistance. Yes, Black history in a society that refuses to shed its white supremacy is contraband. Yet self-preservation is non-negotiable. We must defend our stories, our community, our humanity, and our future, no matter the cost. Part 1. How We Got Here. On Racial Justice, Black History, Critical Race Theory, and Other Felonious Ideas. Robin D.G. Kelley. We fell under the leadership of those who would compromise with truth in the past in order to make peace in the present and guide policy in the future. W.E.B. Du Bois, Black Reconstruction in America. It is strange that the friends of truth and the promoters of freedom have not risen up against the present propaganda in the schools and crushed it. This crusade is much more important than the anti-lynching movement, because there would be no lynching if it did not start in the classroom. Carter G. Woodson, The Miseducation of the Negro. On January 20th, 2023, Florida Education Commissioner Manny Diaz Jr. tweeted out a chart justifying the state's decision to ban schools from teaching a newly created advanced placement course in African American studies. The graphic singled out the curriculum's inclusion of Black queer studies, intersectionality, Black feminist literary thought, reparations, and the movement for Black lives as egregious violations of the law. It also identified scholars whose work was included in an earlier iteration of the curriculum as radical propagandists bent on smuggling critical race theory, CRT, Marxism, and deviant sexuality into high school classrooms. Despite the fact that the College Board had not yet released the final curriculum to the public, Diaz, as well as Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, claimed it violated Senate Bill 148, better known as the Stop Wrongs to Our Kids and Employees Act, or the Stop Woke Act. Sponsored by Diaz and signed into law in April 2022, the law prohibits teaching anything that might cause guilt, anguish, or other forms of psychological distress, or indoctrinate or persuade students to a particular viewpoint that is inconsistent with state academic standards. In other words, introducing and teaching race, gender, sexuality, and anything remotely resembling critical race theory was strictly prohibited. When the College Board released the final curriculum 11 days later, it had changed substantially. Most of the material the Florida Department of Education, FDOE, found offensive was removed or downgraded from mandatory to optional topics. The revised 234-page curriculum eliminated queer studies, critical race theory, mass incarceration, and a section titled Black Struggle in the 21st Century, made the Black Lives Matter movement and reparations optional research projects, expanded its coverage of ancient African history, and added units on Black conservatism and Afrofuturism. The names of every offending author were removed, most of whom we've included in this book. The College Board insisted it did not bow to political pressure, despite a trove of email exchanges with the FDOE discussing potentially prohibited content and a final letter thanking the board for removing topics FDOE had deemed discriminatory and historically fictional. The fact is, the College Board stood to lose millions of dollars if the state of Florida canceled its AP courses. Although a federal judge blocked portions of the Stop Woke Act that restricted academic freedom in public colleges and universities, the law still applies to private businesses and K-12 education, which would include the College Board. Rather than accept a watered-down curriculum bereft of the theories, concepts, and interdisciplinary methods central to Black studies, students, teachers, scholars, and social justice activists fought back, organizing a nationwide day of action on May 3, 2023, calling out the College Board and defending the integrity of Black studies. Apparently it worked. A week before the national protest, the College Board announced plans to revise the curriculum yet again, implying they may restore some of the excised concepts and material. As of this writing, however, no specific changes have been announced. We put together Our History Has Always Been Contraband in response to the latest war on Black studies, provoked in part by efforts to introduce an advanced placement course in African American studies into our nation's high schools. We felt an urgent need to respond, not only to right-wing lies and the whitewashing of U.S. history, but also to an ill-informed mainstream discourse over the meaning, purpose, and scholarly value of Black studies. Despite the claims of even well-meaning and sympathetic pundits, Black studies courses are not designed to serve Black students alone, but all students. The point is not to raise self-esteem or make students feel guilty, nor is Black studies merely a diversity project. The essays and collected readings gathered here should make it indisputably clear that Black studies is a legitimate intellectual endeavor, one that does not sit at the margins of social inquiry, but at the very center. Our History Has Always Been Contraband is intended for students, educators, and policymakers, as well as general audiences interested in the subject and seeking to understand the politics behind the current attack on critical education. The readings are by no means meant to be comprehensive or representative of what is truly a vast interdisciplinary field. We deliberately selected texts and authors who had been excluded from the AP African American Studies curriculum, as well as a few canonical texts in African American Studies appropriate for high school students. While Black Studies is an interdisciplinary and global project, the latest version of the curriculum places a heavy emphasis on history centered on the U.S. and pre-colonial Africa. We chose to stress the interdisciplinarity of Black studies by selecting readings that cut across and between literature, political theory, law, psychology, sociology, gender and sexuality studies, queer and feminist theory, as well as history. Works by Barbara Christian, Stuart Hall, Kimberly Crenshaw, Saidiya Hartman, Khalil Gibran Muhammad, and others exemplify how multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary scholarship help us understand the systems that govern our lives and what is required to change them. We also decided to spotlight the writings of insurgent Black intellectuals, such as David Walker, Frederick Douglass, Anna Julia Cooper, Zora Neale Hurston, W.E.B. Du Bois, C.L.R. James, James Baldwin, Barbara Smith, Toni Cade Bambara, Bell Hooks, and Angela Y. Davis. To study their work is to think with them, through manifold crises and toward liberation, however defined, that is, abolition, feminism, racial justice, economic empowerment, self-determination, desegregation, decolonization, reparations, queer liberation, cultural and artistic freedom, and the like. Black studies itself has a history, and it is often a story of internal conflict and principled debate. To introduce students to this contested history, we've enlisted writings by Carter G. Woodson, Robert Allen, June Jordan, and Manning Marable. That most of the book is U.S.-centered is an obvious limitation, but a deliberate choice given space limitations and our decision to produce a text that corresponds with the developing AP African American Studies curriculum. The Long War. The right's vehement opposition to Black studies is predictable. Black studies has been under attack since its formal inception on college campuses in the late 1960s. We can go back even further. Most state laws prohibiting enslaved Africans from learning to read and write were introduced after 1829. In response, first to the publication of David Walker's Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World, an unrelenting attack on slavery, and then to Nat Turner's Rebellion 2 years later. The appeal was contraband. Anyone caught with it faced imprisonment or execution. Today, it is a foundational text in Black studies. Historian Jarvis R. Givens found that during the Jim Crow era, Black school teachers often deployed fugitive tactics and risked losing their jobs in order to teach Black history. In Mississippi, organizers with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, taught contraband history in freedom schools, while the Council of Federated Organizations, COFO, established freedom libraries throughout the state stocked with donated books, many on Black history by Black authors. Between 1964 and 1965, white terrorists burned down the freedom libraries in Vicksburg, Laurel, and Indianola. Who's afraid of Black studies? White supremacists, fascists, and the ruling class, the status quo, and yes, even some liberals. As well they should be. Now, I'm not suggesting that everything done in the name of Black studies is insurgent and challenges the social order. Like any other field of study, sharp divisions and disagreements abound. But unlike mainstream academic disciplines, Black studies was born out of a struggle for freedom and a genuine quest to understand the world in order to change it. The object of study has been Black life, the structures that produce premature death, the ideologies that render Black people less than human, and the material consequences, and the roles colonialism and slavery played in the emergence of modernity, presenting political and moral philosophy with its most fundamental challenge. Black studies grew out of and interrogates the long struggle to secure our future as a people and for humanity by remaking and re-envisioning the world through ideas, art, and social movements. Consequently, it emerged as both an intellectual and political project, without national boundaries and borders. The late political theorist Cedric J. Robinson described Black studies as a critique of Western civilization. A chief target of this critique has been the interpretation of history. Battles over the teaching of history are never purely intellectual contests between ignorance and enlightenment, or reducible to demands to insert marginalized people into the curriculum. Contrary to the common liberal complaint that schools ignore the history of slavery and racism, Black and Native people, or more precisely, the figments of the white imagination they called Negroes and savages, have long occupied a place in school history curricula. Generations of students learned that white people settled the wilderness, took rightful ownership of the land from bloodthirsty Indians who didn't know what to do with it, and brought the gift of civilization and democracy to North America and the rest of the world. During most of the 20th century, students were taught that Negroes were perfectly happy as slaves, until some conniving Republicans and carpetbaggers persuaded them otherwise. Leading history books by Ivy League professors repeated the myth, and D.W. Griffith made the world's first epic film by depicting how the great and noble Ku Klux Klan saved America from the evils of Reconstruction. Of course, Black scholars and their allies consistently contested these narratives, an especially poignant example being W.E.B. Du Bois's epic text, Black Reconstruction in America, which included a final chapter calling out the ideological war on truth masquerading as objective scholarship. In The Propaganda of History, an excerpt is included in this collection. Du Bois believes in reason, but comes to see its futility in the face of white supremacy and colonial rule. Critical analysis did not prevail because he was writing against one of the most stupendous efforts the world ever saw to discredit human beings, an effort involving universities, history, science, social life, and religion. Du Bois wasn't out to make a name for himself in the field of 19th century U.S. history. He was trying to understand the roots of fascism in Europe and in his native land. And he witnessed the battle over the interpretation of history play out in the streets, state houses, courts, and newspapers for decades, often with deadly consequences. The rise of the second Ku Klux Klan in 1915 was inspired in part by a national campaign to erase the history of Reconstruction. The chief catalyst was Griffith's aforementioned masterwork of racist propaganda, Birth of a Nation, released in 1915, the same year the renowned Black historian Carter G. Woodson founded the Association for the Study of Negro Life in History. Based on Thomas Dixon's racist novel, The Klansman, Griffith recast the rebels as saviors in white hoods who redeemed the South from rapacious, ignorant Negroes and shifty carpetbaggers, obliterating all vestiges of the black struggle to bring genuine democracy to the South and the nation. Respectable white supremacists, such as the Ladies' Memorial Associations and the United Daughters of the Confederacy, founded in 1894, waged their own soft power campaign of building monuments to the defenders of slavery in the region and around the nation's capital. Note that the movement to erect statues celebrating Confederate war heroes took off in the early 20th century, not immediately after the end of Reconstruction. Why? Because it took over 3 decades of white terrorism, political assassination, lynching, disenfranchisement, and federal complicity to destroy the last vestiges of a biracial labor movement for white supremacy and Jim Crow to reign supreme. In other words, public monuments projected the same propaganda Du Bois found in the history books. Reinventing critical race theory. What the right demonizes as CRT bears no resemblance to actual critical race theory, a 4 decades old body of work that interrogates why anti-discrimination law not only fails to remedy structural racism, but further entrenches racial inequality. Racism, they argue, isn't just about individual bias or prejudice, but a social and political construct embedded in our legal system. Taking a page straight from the old anti-communist playbook, the right has reduced CRT to an incendiary dog whistle in order to generate fear. In a textbook case of obfuscation, an anti-racist academic project is turned into a racist plot to teach white children to hate themselves, their country, and their race. The chief architect of this strategy is Christopher Rufo, currently a senior fellow at the arch-conservative Manhattan Institute, who, in the wake of the mass protests sparked by the killing of George Floyd, declared that the spread of critical race theory was behind the unrest. By his own admission, Rufo sought the perfect villain to mobilize opposition to the anti-racist insurgency and had no qualms about distorting CRT to do it. Ignoring the scholarship while naming the scholars, notably the late Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw, he presumed that these 3 words, strung together, connotes hostile, academic, divisive, race-obsessed, poisonous, elitist, anti-American. As he explained to his Twitter followers in 2021, the plan was to rebrand CRT and eventually turn it toxic, as we put all of the various cultural insanities under that brand category. The goal is to have the public read something crazy in the newspaper and immediately think critical race theory. We have decodified the term and will recodify it to annex the entire range of cultural constructions that are unpopular with Americans. Rufo's ploy soon became White House policy. In fact, Rufo helped draft Trump's now rescinded Executive Order 13950, issued on September 22, 2020, which warned of a left-wing ideology on the horizon threatening to infect core institutions of our country by promoting race or sex stereotyping or scapegoating. The document pitted this invented ideology against the principles of colorblindness derived from a distorted reading of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to justify eliminating workplace diversity and inclusion training in federal agencies. Rufo's popularization of a spurious definition of CRT, backed by the White House, helped spawn a wave of anti-CRT legislation. According to a recent study released by UCLA's Critical Race Studies program, from the start of 2021 to the end of 2022, federal, state, and local legislative and governing bodies introduced 563 anti-CRT measures, nearly half of which have been enacted or adopted. At least 94% of the successful measures target K-12 education, affecting nearly half of all public school children in the country. To be clear, these measures target not just CRT, but liberal multiculturalism, and more pointedly, black studies, ethnic studies, gender studies, and any modern academic discipline that critically studies race and gender. From here on, I will refer to this scholarship collectively as Critical Race and Gender Studies, make specific references to Black Studies or CRT when appropriate, and use we occasionally when explaining what scholars in these fields do. Most of these bills share identical language because they derive from model legislation drafted by right-wing think tanks, including the America First Policy Institute, the Center for American Freedom, the Heritage Foundation, the American Enterprise Institute, Citizens for Renewing America, Alliance for Free Citizens, the American Legislative Exchange Council, and the Ethics and Public Policy Center. It is ironic that bills allegedly intended to protect education from politics and defend academic freedom are backed by well-funded partisan think tanks. In fact, Stanley Kurtz, a leading critic of the African-American AP course, who masquerades as an investigative journalist for the National Review, ironically named the model anti-CRT legislation he drafted for the Ethics and Public Policy Center the Partisanship Out of Civics Act. Much of the text was lifted from the section of Executive Order 13950 prohibiting the teaching of divisive concepts. These concepts include the idea that one race or sex is inherently superior to others, that the U.S. is fundamentally racist or sexist, that a person, by virtue of his or her race or sex, is inherently racist, sexist, or oppressive, that an individual, by virtue of his or her race or sex, bears responsibility for actions committed in the past by other members of the same race or sex, that meritocracy, or traits such as a hard work ethic, are racist or sexist, or were created by a particular race to oppress another race, and that no student should feel discomfort, guilt, anguish, or any other form of psychological distress on account of his or her race or sex. The assumption here is that confronting the history of American racism would provoke feelings of guilt and shame in white kids and their parents. Meanwhile, the psychological distress black, brown, and indigenous students frequently endure as a result of whitewashed curriculum, tracking, suspensions, and expulsions on the slightest pretext, even abuses by law enforcement inside their own classrooms, is never considered. Such allegations against critical race and gender studies strain credulity. No serious scholar believes that someone is inherently racist, sexist, or oppressive, whether consciously or unconsciously, solely by virtue of his or her race or sex. Instead, we teach the opposite, that race is neither fixed nor biological, but socially constructed. Modern categories of racial classification were European creations of the Enlightenment era that relied on a false science to claim that discrete racial groups share inherent traits or characteristics. We reject such claims as essentialists and recognize that behaviors and ideas attributed to race, gender, class, and sexuality are not inherent but ideological, and therefore dynamic and subject to change. The belief that hierarchies of race and gender are based on inherent characteristics is the basis for the ideologies of white supremacy and patriarchy. Such ideologies have been used to justify conquest, dispossession, slavery, segregation, the exclusion of women and black people from the franchise, wage differentials based on race and gender, welfare and housing policies, marriage and family law, even the denial of women's right to bodily autonomy. Whereas many conservatives backing anti-CRT legislation actually subscribe to the idea that certain differences are inherent, that is, fixed and immutable, especially regarding gender, CRT, and black studies do not. To put it bluntly, the argument that people are inherently racist, sexist, or oppressive because of their race is a gross tautology. CRT, on the other hand, uses evidence-based research to show that policies that further racial, class, and gender inequality need not be intentional, and that anyone, irrespective of race, can be anti-racist. Likewise, to accuse CRT of teaching that meritocracy or traits such as hard work ethic are racist literally turns its interpretation of U.S. history on its head. What black studies and critical race theory reveal is the extent to which wealth was accrued through the labor and land of others. The foundational wealth of the country, concentrated in the hands of a few, was built on stolen land, indigenous dispossession, stolen labor, slavery, and the exploitation of immigrant, female, and child labor, whose lower status and vulnerability suppressed their wages considerably. Finally, critical scholarship on race and gender categorically rejects the claim that any individual bears responsibility for actions committed in the past by other members of the same race or sex.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?